Спасибо вам всем. Thank you very much for the ability to participate in the conference. I've really enjoyed it. Can you hear me? Yeah. The subject of this paper is relief work with Jewish war victims during the First World War and Civil War, years 1914 to 21. The focus is two organizations, ЕКОПО and Евобщестком, or in Yiddish, Идгезком. ЕКОПО, еврейский комитет помощи жертвам войны, established in August 1914 in Petrograd, became the most powerful Jewish organization in Russia during World War I, helped resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees and expellees, беженцев и выселенцев. Евобщестком, еврейский общественный комитет помощи жертвам войны и погромов, or in Yiddish, as I said, Idgezkom, Jiddische Gesellschaftlicher Komitee, was also founded during wartime in July 1920. It came about as an agreement between the Soviet government and the Joint, which supplied all of its funding. Евобком worked with victims of civil war pogroms, primarily in Ukraine. It established orphanages, shelters, hospitals, clinics, workshops for artisans. One word about my sources and also the approach. Евобком became an interest of mine because I had been researching the First World War for several years. I found little, though, on Евобком and the relief work that it conducted during the Civil War. The first article that was published about Евобком was in Hebrew by Mordechai Altshuler, 1983, and he described Евобком there as the first Soviet Jewish public organization, a predecessor for Oziet in the 1930s and the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the 40s. There's a recent book by Michael Bezer on the Joint, which has a chapter on Евобком, and he uses there many Russian and Ukrainian archival sources. However, he does not include any Yiddish sources, and that's significant because Yiddish is a language in which many of the relief workers themselves wrote their memoirs. So these sources, and especially the published Yiddish sources, can really complement the archival documents. In terms of the approach, I find it worthwhile to look at ЕКОПО and Евобком together, 1914 to 1921, simply because the Civil War followed the World War. And these were years of continuous war, and because of that, years of continuous relief work. Not of course, not just for Jews, but for all people of Eastern Europe. The revolution, of course, introduced many important changes to Jewish relief work, but there are also important continuities that we can see before and after the revolution. My thesis is that Евобком's origins can be traced to ЕКОПО's work during the First World War, and more broadly to traditions of Jewish philanthropy that were developed during the late imperial Russian times, which is a subject of work by Brian Horowitz and others. Евобком was the first Soviet Jewish public organization, but it drew upon the expertise, strategies, and most importantly, the financial resources that ЕКОПО acquired during the First World War. In addition, after World War I, ЕКОПО and other pre-revolutionary Jewish aid organizations continued to work in those very regions in Ukraine and Belarus where pogroms took place in 1919. During those years, ЕКОПО established its legitimacy and reliability as a Jewish aid organization, and the relationship it developed previously with the Joint proved crucial in the Joint's decision to establish and fund ЕКОПО in 1920. The continuities and changes between ЕКОПО and Евобком include those regarding individual aid workers, strategies of the work, financial resources, and relationships to political authorities. To illustrate some of the continuities, I will also discuss two notable aid workers, the first Nachum Gergel and the second Yitzhak Gitterman. And both of them began working for ЄКОПО in 1915, and they continued doing aid work throughout that period with Евобщестком until 1921. First, I'll discuss a little bit about ЄКОПО. Its activities during World War I encompassed a range of welfare services for the refugees and expellees, both within the Pale of Settlement and in the Russian interior. ЄКОПО served as an umbrella organization for existing Jewish philanthropies, including ОЗ, Общество хранения здоровья евреев, also the ОП, Общество для распространения просвещения между евреями в России, and ОРТ, Общество ремесленного и земледелческого труда среди евреев в России. These organizations together had expertise in providing shelter, transportation, food, medicine, education, labor training, and loans. And these were all mobilized in the service of aiding war victims, particularly children and the elderly. Those populations made up half of the population that ЄКОПО served. ЄКОПO's central committee was in Petrograd, but parallel committees with its name were formed in Moscow, Kiev, and as far east as Harbin. The Imperial Ministry of the Interior granted ЄКОПО a status of national committee and supplied nearly half of its budget. ЄКОПО also, as I said, established an important relationship with Western Jewish philanthropies, and primarily the Joint, which was founded for that purpose to serve war victims in Eastern Europe and New York. And the Joint supplied almost a quarter of ЄКОPO's budget throughout the war. ЄКОPO's leaders were well-known Russian Jewish patrons, the Ginsburg family and the banker Warshawski. However, it was staffed by educated professionals, doctors, statisticians, journalists, and others. In addition, and this is important, ЄКОPО employed hundreds of young Jews in Russia who had no previous aid work experience. They played a crucial role in the organization's work, as I'll say more about in a minute, and they also helped to democratize ЄКОPО and draw its policies to the left. ЄКОPO pioneered strategies for coordinating aid on a massive scale across the empire. It was in terms of Jewish history, it was the largest relief campaign ever undertaken in Jewish history. By 1916, the organization served nearly 300,000 refugees in 170 local committees spanning from European Russia to Siberia. The key role in this work were so-called plenipotentiaries, or representatives, in Russian, uполномоченные. Many were dispatched by the Moscow, Kiev, and Petrograd committees to surrounding regions. I mentioned that young people were important. The majority of the uполномоченные were young people who were willing to travel, and travel particularly into dangerous areas of fighting from where the refugees and expellees were coming. The uполномоченные established aid committees where none existed, or where they did already exist in local communities. The uполномоченные provided guidance, funds, and other types of support. They accompanied groups of refugees as they traveled east to make sure they found shelter. And in addition to these local aid committees, there were already existing, for example, clinics or schools that had been there before the war, run by OZE, for example, and these became expanded and received ЄКОПО funding during the war. The uполномоченные had two important jobs. They were aid workers on the one hand, but they were also worked as correspondents who documented facts on the ground and reported back to ЄКОPO central committees about conditions of Jews in each location. This reporting was an important part of ЄКОPO's work. Publicity and documentation were strategic elements of Jewish war relief. ЄКОПО published its own newspaper starting in 1916. It was under the title Помощь, and then subsequently renamed Дело Помощь. And in these newspapers, relief workers contributed many of the articles. In their articles for these papers, they debated the future of Jewish society in Russia. They advocated secular cultural nationalism, modern education, whether in Russian or Yiddish, and they actively fought the funding of heders in meetings, for example. They argued against rabbis who sought funding for heders. And these conflicts, these are between the young aid workers and the rabbinic authorities. These are the kinds of things that are documented in the Yiddish memoirs written by relief workers. We can say from this brief overview that YEKOPO established a basic strategy for aid work by 1917. And the approach pioneered by YEKOPO outlasted the changes that followed the October Revolution and also the catastrophe of pogroms in 1919. Every subsequent Jewish aid organization that worked with pogrom victims used YEKOPO's model. Moreover, as I noted before, YEKOPO, ORT, and OZE continued working in Ukraine and Belarus after 1917. Their committees, clinics, shelters, and schools operated during the first years of the Civil War. In January 1919, Jewish aid work entered a new phase in reaction to the large pogroms in Avryuch, Berdichev, and Zhytomyr. The Ministry of Jewish Affairs in the revived Ukrainian government, short-lived directory, gave 1.5 million rubles, which was a very small sum given inflation, to establish a central committee for the aid of pogrom victims, Centralny Komitet. This central committee lasted just 5 months, January to May 1919. It functioned in the role that YEKOPO had played during the World War. Every Jewish public organization and political party in Kiev joined the Central Committee, including YEKOPO, OZE, and the Kultur League. The Bolsheviks arrived in Kiev in February 1919, but they allowed the Central Committee to function, and they closed it only in May 1919. At that time, they replaced it with the Russian Red Cross, Российское общество Красного Креста, Pogrom Division. Many of the aid workers who had worked for the Central Committee and then before that YEKOPO then joined the Red Cross Pogrom Unit. When the Soviets consolidated authority in Ukraine in early 1920, any form of charity directed exclusively toward Jews came under attack. The Soviet government identified pogrom victims not as victims of anti-Jewish violence, but of the, quote, counter-revolution. The work of helping victims of counter-revolution fell to the Commissariat of Social Welfare, but needs among Jewish war victims outstripped the resources that the Soviet government could offer. In June 1920, joint leaders, Representatives Fisher and Pine, came to Moscow and they negotiated with the Soviet government and Communist Party to legally establish a Jewish aid organization. A total of 16 Jewish, Soviet, and Communist organizations came together and were represented on the Evobkom Presidium, and that's when Evobkom was formed. Communist and government agencies dominated the committee, but the joint representatives, Fisher and Pine, insisted on the inclusion of these veteran, that's what they were called, veteran public organizations, YEKOPO, ORT, OZE, and Kultur League. And these brought the technical and practical expertise that allowed Evobkom to continue carrying on relief. This arrangement between the American Jewish philanthropists, the Russian Jewish public organizations, and the Soviet government led to, predictably, a power struggle, but it also temporarily allowed for distribution of American food, clothing, and medicine to pogrom victims, and particularly children in Ukraine in late 1920 and early 1921. In February 1921, YEKOPO and the other veteran aid organizations formally withdrew from Evobkom. However, even beyond that point, Evobkom retained several of the former staff, particularly of the OZE physicians, in order to continue carrying out relief work. Евобщестком continued several of ЕКОПО's strategies developed during the First World War. First, the structure of centralized control and coordination of localities through the use of the уполномоченный. Second, the уполномоченные continued to work in this double role as aid workers and correspondents. Like ЕКОПО's Russian newspapers, Помощь and Дело Помощь, Евобщестком established its own newspaper in Yiddish, Hilf, or relief. Of course, the Joint also continued to support Евобщестком as it had supported ЕКОПО, but whereas the Russian imperial government had provided nearly half of ЕКОПО's budget during the First World War, the Soviet government provided none of Евобщестком's budget and left it to the bourgeois Joint to provide the funds. By way of conclusion, I'll give brief biographies of two quite remarkable Jewish aid workers, Nachum Gergel and Yitzhak Gitterman. Gergel was born in Rakhmistrovska near Kiev in Ukraine. He was 27 years old when World War I broke out. He worked as an уполномоченный for the Petrograd ЕКОПО. He was sent to the Minsk region, so he worked in many towns around the city, and he gained extensive experience organizing and directing aid committees. Later, he served on the Petrograd ЕКОПО Executive Committee. In 1917, Gergel moved to Kiev. He worked in the Ministry of Jewish Affairs under Moshe Silberfarb. In 1919, he joined the Central Committee for Aid to Pogrom Victims, and he also at that time worked with Cherikover, who had formed the editorial committee to gather documentary materials about the pogroms. Gergel in May 1919, joined the Russian Red Cross Pogrom Division in the Kiev office. After Евобщестком's establishment, he was appointed to its executive committee. Gergel left Евобщестком in 1921 and emigrated to Berlin. And there, as is well known, he conducted extensive research with Cherikover's pogrom archive, part of which had migrated to Berlin. And in 1928, he published a statistical survey of pogrom locations and victims in Yiddish. This article was subsequently translated into English, and today Gergel's estimates remain some of the most widely accepted figures, and those who work with pogrom historiography will be familiar with the importance of his work. Another important figure was Yitzhak Gitterman. Like Gergel, he was born in a shtetl near Kiev. He was young, 25 years old, when the war broke out. During the First World War, he worked for ЕКОПО, which was ЕКОПO's equivalent organization in Kiev, and was in the Russian Army's southwest front zone. Gitterman helped resettle Jewish expellees from Galicia in 1915. After the war, he continued to work for ЕКОПО and also the OZE in Zhytomyr, where he directed an orphanage. The region around Zhytomyr came under Polish army occupation, and the Joint was able to enter there and establish an aid committee. Gitterman was asked to direct it. In January 1919, he joined the Central Committee for Aid to Pogrom Victims in Kiev, and like Gergel, he gathered documentary materials about the pogrom materials in and around Volyn, then also joined the Russian Red Cross Pogrom Division. In 1920, his organization, the ЕКОПО, and also the OZE, became part of Евобщестком. Gitterman left Евобщестком similar to Gergel in 1921. He emigrated to Poland. There he became, in the 1930s, the joint director for the entire country, and he became quite well known in that role. He mentored Emanuel Ringelblum and worked actively for the Joint up until his death in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, when he was killed. For both Gergel and Gitterman, the experiences they acquired during the First World War working for ЕКОПО allowed them to become leaders of aid work during the Civil War. In Gitterman's particular case, he even continued to serve as a relief worker through the Second World War and Holocaust. To conclude, Евобщестком was the first Soviet Jewish organization, but its achievements clearly depended on aid workers who gained their skills in the earlier war. Scholarship previously has examined continuities from the First World War to the Civil War in other realms, particularly anti-Jewish violence. We can also show, however, continuities during these years in the responses of Jews to the violence against them as they adapted to hardships caused by mass expulsions, military pogroms, the upheavals of war and revolution, and establishment of Soviet power. Thank you.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста, вопросы. Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, Polly. I was wondering if you could comment on whether these Jewish organizations, kind of the place of these Jewish organizations in the context of other, I guess, refugee organizations in the course of the First World War, as far as national bodies, really. Because I think from Peter Guttrell's Whole Empire Walking, there's the creation of maybe ad hoc national bodies for, I think, Baltic groups. And he kind of tracks that as the beginning of a national movement for some of these groups. Now, of course, the Jewish situation is different because there's no pogroms against the Balts. So I wonder if we would place this within that context, or within, or kind of bridging kind of different traditions, I suppose, because there's also, I can see how there's a separate kind of Jewish history of mutual aid organizing that's separate from all that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes and yes. ЕКОПО was a Jewish national committee, and some have argued it functioned almost in a quasi-autonomy, governmental, pre-governmental form of autonomy. And at the same time, it was rooted in earlier traditions of philanthropy and aid work among Jews, but it also was a response to the war, and can be compared to the groups, similar aid committees that were formed for Muslims and all variety of nationalities that were expelled during the war.
Спасибо. Есть ли еще вопросы?
Thank you very much. I hope I didn't miss it at the very beginning, but could you talk a little bit about the sources that you're working with? I'd just be curious to hear more.
Sure. So they're archival and published. The archives are in Sedavo. There's a very large fund on Евобщеском's work in Ukraine, and they're also in local archives in the Kiev Oblast Archive. There's a very large collection of documents, mostly in Russian. And then in terms of published sources, what I mentioned is that Yiddish sources, the previous works that have discussed Евобщестком, there are very few, but they generally don't utilize memoirs written by the relief workers, many of which were published in Yiddish.
Спасибо.